I'm Scott Sagan, the co-director here at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. I want to welcome you to this seminar featuring Naima Green-Riley. Naima is a Stanford graduate, an undergraduate in international relations here, went to the State Department where she served for 5 years, including a stint in China, which influenced her PhD thesis, and also in Egypt. She has a PhD from Harvard and now is an assistant professor jointly appointed at the Department of Politics in the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton. So join me in welcoming back to Stanford, Naima Green-Riley. Thank you, Naima. After she speaks, we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and I will go back and forth. I'll call on people, we'll issue a two-finger rule. So get on the queue with one finger, jump the queue if you have a two-finger, want to intervene right on the question. And I'll also take questions from the online audience. And those people online, please put your questions into the Q&A and I'll read them out. Anyway, welcome.
Thank you so much. And it is really lovely to be back on Stanford. I keep saying this, I'm a broken record, but just walking through campus, I walked from West Campus to East Campus, and I used to live in Lagunitas. So just walking that route was really nice. Great to be here. This is my second talk of the day, so I'm hoping that I'm coherent during the second talk of the day. But I'm going to be presenting to you some new research. This is based on an academic research project that I'm doing, but I think it actually has a lot of policy relevance as well. And it's a project that has a couple of co-authors on it. Two of us are IR scholars, myself and Josh Kertzer at Harvard, and then two are REP scholars, so race and ethnic politics Americanist political scientists, Laird and Julian Wamble. And so the idea was to join forces and to try and link some of the themes in the literature together to better understand how Black communities think about foreign policy and how those ways of thinking differ from how white Americans might think about foreign policy, which is something that has not been done enough. And so I'm going to tell you a bit about the origins of this research. And it's funny, I feel like I'm telling like an origin story. It began when I was in grad school. So I went to grad school to get my PhD at Harvard. And when I was there for a second year paper, another student sort of came up to me and said, "Hey, I've been looking at this data and something really interesting is going on. And I don't think people have been writing about this. So let's look into it further." And so this is some of the data that we were pulling. This is actually one of the early plots that we made in 2017. And it's data from the Pew Research Center. It was a 2017 poll, and it asked respondents how they would react to some airstrikes that had just happened in Syria, and then also to a hypothetical situation involving airstrikes against North Korea. And what we were finding is that there were these big gaps in how Black and white Americans were answering this question. And we saw marked differences in the level of enthusiasm about the use of force. And this is not even like on the ground force, this is airstrikes in an international context. And so we actually decided it would be most important to see if this was a partisan thing. Over 90% of African Americans vote Democrat. Many people might say off the bat, "Oh, okay, it's because Democrats are Black people are Democrats, and Democrats don't support the use of force as much." But even in our Democratic sample, so here and then here, we still saw the statistically significant difference in support for this form of force. And we thought that was something that was interesting and notable. So we started to look into the political science literature. And we said, who's written about this and how have they talked about it in the past? So this is a paper from 1967, cast of characters, including the, of course, legendary Sidney Verba, and it talks about support for the Vietnam War. And what you see is that there are these differences in how white and non-white Americans, these surveys were not sophisticated enough to even ask for your race if you weren't white. But differences in how white and non-white Americans were thinking about escalation or de-escalation in the Vietnam War. And there were some real differences. This is a book that many may have read by John Mueller. It talks about, once again, public opinion and war. And in this case as well, what you see is that in his surveys, there are differences in the way that Black and white Americans talk about the use of force internationally. And so there's this point in the book when Mueller says, look, the causes for Black opposition to Vietnam, they don't seem to just have to do with like the domestic political turmoil that's happening now or that happened in the 1960s, a decade ago. It seems like there's something else going on here, and they must have to do with the Black experience. But then that's it. He doesn't say, what about the Black experience? He doesn't say what's going on. And so you're sort of left to ponder that by yourself. And so all of this, all of these findings led us eventually to write an article about gaps in support for a much more recent conflict, the Iraq War. And we do also in that paper replications of our models for the Afghanistan War, where you see persistent lack of support for political force in current conflicts or in recent conflicts. They weren't current by the time we were studying them. And so the security studies piece is out. It came out last year. And then we wrote a foreign affairs piece that also talks about the findings from that study. And basically, we find a few things in this article. So first of all, we discover that this race gap is persistent. It's not just something that you saw during the Vietnam War, saw during the Gulf War. We talk a little bit about different conflicts where you do see a race gap coming out. It happens in many conflicts, not all conflicts, but it's something that's very recurrent. And we also talk about the fact that we want to figure out what things might be motivating that hesitance about the use of force. And so we test a number of mediators, a number of potential things that might explain the relationship between being Black and having a lesser amount of enthusiasm about the use of force. And one thing that we find currently, and this goes very much with, if you look at like policy accounts or Black political activists in ways they talk about international relations, a concern over casualties. And here's the reason why. So specifically, Black communities are very likely to think that when the US goes to war, it's Black people who are going to die. And that's not completely something that's never happened, right? So during the Vietnam War, the first few years of the war, I think 25% of the casualties were Black, 11 or 12% of those who were fighting were Black. And so there was this overrepresentation within the casualties at that point. Things like that, episodes like that, have led to enduring feelings within certain Black communities that there's something to be wary about when the US goes to war. We look at a number of other things having to do with levels of political alienation from the president in office, feelings of concern about using defense spending that might otherwise go to domestic spending. Casualties seems to be the biggest explanatory variable, although there are some others. We're not the only ones who have done research on this. Others have looked at racial demographics and then the relationship of racial demographics to people's political attitudes, and particularly their attitudes on foreign policy. So recently there was a paper by Diana Mutz et al. That looks at trade preferences and finds that white Americans tend to be more protectionist than minority communities. There is a paper by Jonathan Green that, I think his name is John Green, but Green 2021, that looks at white Americans' domestic racial attitudes and links those on to attitudes about foreign policy, for example, support for apartheid, things like this, and shows that there are correlations there. And so this idea that race is related to foreign policy attitudes is not unique, but there's more to be done. So we already have done some research, my co-author and I already did some research about feelings about how Black Americans think about the use of force as compared to white Americans. Well, what are some other areas where you might see gaps in foreign policy? Well, what about the fact that here you see a picture of Coretta Scott King marching against apartheid in South Africa? It seems like if foreign policies have to do with a certain topic, right, topic in Africa, maybe there's a greater likelihood that African Americans would care. Black Americans and communities of color tend to be disproportionately affected by climate change. So those experiences in the US with these types of things might affect their views of foreign policy. And many see the Black Lives Matter movement as a humanitarian issue. And so if that's seen in that realm as human rights, a humanitarian issue, then maybe that links on to views about humanitarian issues in other parts of the world. And so this was the thinking that led us to this research. So we've got a couple of research objectives. I will tell you about each. First, we want to demonstrate where there are actually Black-white racial differences in attitudes about foreign policy within the American public. We want to try and figure out two things about those gaps. So first, their size, which ones are really big, which ones are really small, and then their direction. So which ones move in a direction where Black people are more supportive or in agreement with certain types of policies or statements, and where are Black people less enthusiastic or less supportive. And theoretically, we're interested in, as I said before, bringing together these two different types of literature that in the political science realm are often quite far away from each other, something that always sort of perplexed me as a student of international relations. So here's a theory that undergirds this entire project. We argue, and I think that many people have argued before us, that Black and white Americans have fundamentally different lived experiences. Their day-to-day lives are sometimes ordered around the fact that they have racial experiences that are not the same. And so if those experiences exist, then it's likely that they should affect not only domestic policy attitudes, but also foreign policy attitudes. We have a particular focus on Black attitudes in this study because we feel that that's the thing that's really been understudied in the literature, right? So we know a lot about international relations, and often you see these studies that will talk about how white Americans differ from non-white, right? And that leaves a lot to be desired. And so we sort of hone in on the Black experience and talk about that experience in these in the research that's going to follow, just because we think that that's something that's really well needed. We base much of our theoretical grounding on the Black utility heuristic, which is not new, originally theorized by Michael Dawson. And the basic idea with the Black utility heuristic is that because of discrimination, Black people have become sort of a more cohesive unit. They have experienced discrimination that has made them have a similar experience, and therefore their attitudes are seen through or are determined through a lens of race. And so if that is the case, then there should be implications for how that experience has affected their foreign policy attitudes. But it's important to say, especially within fields where we don't usually look at race, we're just like other parts of political science, looking at trends. We're not making sweeping statements about everyone. We're just making sort of observations about the way that things have trended historically in the United States. So in the paper, we sort of draw out some areas of political focus for Black communities that seem to be present in a lot of political discussions in Black communities. And we point out areas that we think have a lot to do with certain foreign policy issues. And whenever there seems to be a convergence, we define this area as a touch point. And so we point out 4 key touch points in our theory. And those 4 are a focus on rights and freedoms, a skepticism of the use of state power, access to resources that is equitable, and empathy for other marginalized groups. And so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on each of these. It is clear that for many years, prominent Black political activists, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, political activists today have focused on liberation, have focused on this idea of winning greater rights and freedoms for African Americans who have experienced oppression and disadvantage in the past. And so we expect that that experience might actually lead Black Americans to resonate with other populations that are experiencing similar types of oppression and lead them to support rights and freedoms-focused foreign policies. Here I point out a few foreign policy issues that might fit into that category. So something that has to do with human rights, something that has to do with democracy promotion, and views of either communism or authoritarianism. So theoretically, it seems like those are the types of foreign policy questions where we might see traction on these issues. We bucket all of those into one theoretical category. Moving on. Black Americans are more likely to experience punitive domestic policies than many other racial groups in the United States. They often experience encounters related to policing or judicial sentencing or incarceration, and often sentences or experiences in jail are different than non-Black peers. And so we think that those experiences, and maybe not even personal experiences, but the threat of them happening, more minor encounters with the law, seeing other people who are part of the community be engaged in processes that feel like they're biased and unfair, can make people hesitant about the exercise of state power. And so that use of force example that I gave earlier fits into this category. There's a concern about the fairness of what happens when Black people go to war. In the same way, you might see other related foreign policy issues fall into this bucket. So you might see people concerned about establishing military bases in other places, or espionage, or counterterrorism efforts. So that's our second theoretical category. Our third category has to do with the equitable access to resources. We know that there's a lot of inequality in the United States. And we know that Black communities often have less access to economic resources, but also environmental resources domestically. And so that desire that exists within many Black communities for access to these resources might actually make them think about foreign policy issues that involve resources, so either redistribution or exchange of resources, differently than white Americans do. And so we propose a number of different foreign policy issues that might be affected by this desire for equitable resources within the United States. And those are foreign aid, foreign trade, and environmental protection, climate change mitigation, those types of things. Finally, we talk about the fact that Black Americans regularly experience discrimination, right? And that experience of discrimination in itself can, according to political psychologists that are not us, create empathy for other groups that experience discrimination, for other oppressed groups. And so we have this hypothesis that's based on the idea of outgroup empathy for other groups that might experience some sort of marginalization. And we think that these foreign policy issues, issues related to immigration or issues related to policies toward Africa, might fit into that theoretical bucket. And so that's sort of a long form explication of the theory behind this. And now I'll go into the data that we used to test this. So Josh Kertzer, professor at Harvard, has another article that aggregates polling questions that were on the CCGA, so the Chicago Council of Global Affairs surveys, over 12 waves. So the first set of questions starts in 1975, the last set of questions in our data set, 2018. And in these questions, or in these surveys, thousands of people have been questioned, right? And so we subset to only those who are identified as Black and white in the surveys, public members of the public, there are also elite surveys. But what you often find with the elite surveys is sometimes they don't even ask a race question. When they do ask a race question, maybe there's like one Black person, maybe they might be in the room, like there's like very few people that you're gonna find in these elite surveys. And so we use the public surveys and we subset to just over 18,000 respondents. But in these questions, there are a range of different topics, right? So there are questions about human rights. This is a question that asks, please indicate how important each item is as a foreign policy goal for the United States, promoting and defending human rights in other countries. Here's a question that asks about military bases. It says, do you think the United States should or should not have a long-term military base in the following place? Turkey. Here's a question about the environment. Based on what you know, do you think the US should or should not participate in a new international treaty to address climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And then here's a question about Africa. There's been some discussion about the circumstances that might justify using US troops in other parts of the world. Would you favor or oppose the use of US troops if South Africa invaded Angola? And so remember that these are surveys over a range of different time periods. Sometimes you have very current events related questions that are not repeated, but overall, we've gotten our sample anything that's foreign policy related over those 12 waves of survey. a few more pieces of information about data. First of all, on questions, we code answers to range from 0 to 1. So you can think of like the least supportive answer as being coded as 0 and the most supportive answer as being coded at 1. In that last example of if you would support the use of troops if South Africa invaded Angola, you would see, I strongly disagree with that decision as a 0. I strongly agree with that decision as a 1. And the observations in our data set are not at the person level. So this is actually important to understand. We have a data set that has 1,500 rows, and each row is a question. It's a foreign policy question. And then we calculate for that question on a particular survey, the difference in the mean score on the question for Black individuals and the mean score on the question for white individuals. And so let's say that the mean score on if the US should use troops if South Africa invades Angola is 0.5 for Black individuals. It means that among all of the Black people on a particular survey who were asked that question, their response was middling, right? Like they were right in the middle of whether or not they thought that force should be used or not in that case. Let's say that the white estimate was 0.25. We can tell from that that Black people were more strongly in favor of the use of force than white Americans were. So that's a key point about our data set. And we have 2 different types of analyses that we do. One of them, as I mentioned before, is about the direction of these racial gaps. So are Black Americans more or less supportive of certain policies? Do they feel more strongly or less strongly than white Americans? And so those particular analyses use this very simple sort of like a subtraction of the means, where you have the Black mean minus the white mean as the quantity of interest. And here we actually have to subset our 1,500 questions to a few less. And the reason why is because some questions don't have a really clear directional nature. And so we're looking for things where you're saying either you're more supportive or you're less supportive, or you're more in agreement or less in agreement with a statement. Like that's a place where you really see directional coherence. We're also looking for questions that are repeated. So if there was only one that was asked in the entire 12 waves of surveys, we wouldn't include it. But when you see like probably it being asked more than 6 or 7 times, that's when we include it in our analyses. And so we group our questions by question topic and then by those larger 4 touch points that I mentioned earlier. The second set of analyses look at the relative magnitude of these racial gaps. And so here we do away with a concern about whether or not feeling is more or less intense on a particular issue. And instead we're looking at absolute gaps. So it doesn't matter in this case if Black people are more or less supportive. What matters is there a gap? And here we're able to evaluate gaps together. So in our directional analyses, we look at one topic at a time, and we can't do something like a regression analysis that allows us to compare, okay, like they're more strongly in favor of this topic over this topic. But we wanted to be able to have some sort of a relative measure here. So here we can do a regression analysis where basically we're looking at the size of gaps and we can tell, okay, these are issues where there's a very large gap. So statistically significant in this sense means that like this is particularly large given all the questions that we have in our sample compared to the sizes of other gaps. So I'm going to show you some of the data that come from the directional analysis first. And in our paper that was circulated, there's a number of different topics that we go through. I'm not going to go through them all because it would take a long time. There are 19 topics. So I'm just going to show you the directional analyses for that first touch point related to rights and freedoms. And so the categories that we find in the data set that were relevant to rights and freedoms were support for human rights, perceived threat of communism, support for cooperating with communist regimes, support for cooperating with dictatorships, and support for spreading democracy. I'm going to go over sort of how to think about reading these results. So on the horizontal axis, you have a year. So each dot is a particular survey question. And then where it appears on the horizontal axis represents when the question was asked. And so questions on over here were asked in the 1970s or 80s. questions over here were asked in the 2010s. So as you can see, there are some questions that weren't even asked after the 1990s, right? They just stopped. On the left side, you see each of the different questions marked as a single dot. But on the left panel here, you see a meta-analytic effect estimate for all of the points that are depicted on the left side. So basically, what we can find out from this depiction is that there have been a number of different questions about human rights in this sample over time. It's been asked, the questions about human rights have been asked consistently. Often it's a question like the one that I showed you. As a foreign policy goal, how important is human rights? Most of the time, you can see that most of those red dots come above this middle line, meaning that most of the time, Black Americans are more supportive of human rights than are white Americans. But there are a few instances when asked questions related to human rights where Black Americans were actually less supportive of the particular thing that was asked than white Americans. But when you look at the meta-analysis of all of those different data points, you see that on average, Black Americans are more supportive of human rights based on the data that we have than are white Americans. So we also see statistically significant differences in opinion for two other variables. For support for cooperating with communist regimes, you actually see less support within Black communities for cooperating with communist regimes between the 1970s and the 1990s. And then you see that Black Americans are more supportive of democracy promotion efforts than are white Americans in many places in the sample. And so 3 of the 5 areas that we investigate seem to have some sort of a statistically significant result, but there are 2 areas where we don't see that, right? So the jury's out. Sometimes communism is seen as a threat by Black Americans, sometimes it's not. Sometimes Black Americans are more supportive of cooperating with dictatorships, sometimes they're not. It might depend on the context, who the dictatorship is. And so we don't find any sort of statistically significant results there. I'm not going to show this level of detail for the other findings, but I am going to run through a summary of what we find in the other touch point categories. So this rights and freedoms category reiterates what I just said. There are 3 areas where we see a statistically significant outcome. In the 2 places where there's nothing there, it means that there's no statistically significant result. We can't make any inferences on those 2 areas. So what we see regarding the skepticism of exercise of state power is that there are many areas where Black Americans are less supportive of something related to the exercise of state power than are white Americans. So Black Americans across the board seem to support having military bases in different places less than white Americans. They seem to support the use of force less than white Americans, so that's a replication. They seem to be less concerned about the threat of terrorism than are white Americans. And then this red one is counterintuitive. We were surprised that there was less support for nuclear arms control among Black Americans when compared to white Americans, because that's counter the argument we're making, right? You would think that if you're concerned about nuclear escalation, you're concerned about the use of force, then you want to support nuclear arms control. And they're also less supportive specifically of the use of force against terrorism. There's some other areas where there are not significant results. I saw a question. Did you want to answer that now?
Just clarifying what you're showing us, this additional black-white response
So yeah, we're not controlling for those other, in this particular analysis, no, we're not controlling for those other things. Yes, this is black-white. There were 2 other touch points. I will talk about the results there. So on the one hand, when it comes to the equitable access to resources, you see Black communities that are Black individuals that are more supportive of giving foreign aid. They believe more that aid prevents communism, or they agree more with that statement. They have greater support for environmental protection than do white respondents. But there are no significant results for ideas about how effective foreign aid is for a number of other reasons. So there are a lot of these questions about, does foreign aid work to do this, to do that? And on that bundle of questions, there was no clear outcome. Also, support for international trade, we don't see significant effects. This is a place where it'd be interesting to look at the paper, because I talked about the Mutz et al. Research paper from 2020 that basically argues that white Americans are more protectionist than our communities of color. And this finding seems to go against that finding. But when you look at our paper, you actually see that across time, in recent years, so towards the right side of the diagram, you actually do see a difference in support for international trade. But across the entire sample, it's null, because in the left side of that same diagram, you don't see that same difference. And their study is new, right? So it relies on data from recent years. In the category of empathy for other marginalized groups, we look at support for immigration. We do find that Black Americans tend to be more supportive of immigration than are white Americans. So those are our directional analyses. Now we're gonna switch. And when we switch, I'm gonna tell you we're gonna switch, and then it takes a second to acclimate yourself to the second set of studies, because we're now thinking of positive, meaning more supportive, and negative as meaning less supportive. But in the absolute gap measure, if you see a positive result, then the gap is larger, it's not necessarily the case that one group is more supportive than another. And a negative result would mean that the gap is smaller than average racial gaps. So let's move on to that. Oh, yeah. Oh, well, actually, that's kind of interesting. As we were sort of reading through our results, we realized that in some ways, these results paint the picture of the Black foreign policy agenda, right? And how it differs from like a different foreign policy agenda. And so we point to a foreign policy agenda that's more enthusiastic about democracy promotion overseas, more supportive of foreign aid, more environmentally conscious, more pro-immigration than is the foreign policy agenda of white counterparts. And on the other hand, it's more skeptical about US military action and less concerned about terrorism than is the white community. Okay, now we're gonna move on to those results that I mentioned that have to do with absolute gaps. And so this is a plot, and I'm gonna explain what it is, that shows over time the size of absolute gaps between Black and white respondents. And basically the line that's on top, the dark blue line, indicates sort of an average, like an average gap size for the questions that have to do with any of the 4 touchpoint topics that we mentioned previously. So about 50% of the questions in our data set have relevance to one of the touch points, and about 50% of the questions in our database, they don't really seem to be related to any one of these touch points. They're related to other foreign policy issues that aren't easy to, what's your support for cooperation on getting oil? It's harder to be clear on exactly where that would fit in. So that's what the top darker line represents. There's a lighter blue line, it's right below that line. There's the average racial gap when a question is not related to a touch point. And so basically what you can see from this diagram is that foreign policy questions related to any of the 4 touch points display significantly larger gaps than do foreign policy issues that are not related to the touch points. This is theoretically good for us, right? This means that there's something about these touch points that is relevant to the way that Black communities are thinking about foreign policy. Something that I'm not going to show you, but that is in the paper, is that we do multivariate regression in which we look at questions that are related to each of these 4 categories. And we then look at which of the touch points, when they're all in one regression, have a statistically significant outcome. And it turns out that 2 of the touch points have larger gaps when compared to the other touch points. And those 2 touch points are the skepticism about the exercise of state power and also questions about empathy for other marginalized groups. We then include in this regression a partisan polarization measure. This is complicated because it's hard to control for demographic features when you're looking at the question level as compared to the individual level. So we basically have a measure for like Republican and Democratic gaps that measures partisan polarization that's similarly calculated to how the racial gap is. And that's how we deal with this type of an analysis. But basically, when we control for partisan polarization, we find that this finding holds. This is a plot that shows some of the regression outcomes for particular subtopics. So no longer in the larger touch point categories, but in the subcategories that are divided by touch point. And what this tells us is that gaps are particularly large in a couple of areas. And so racial gaps are particularly large when it comes to the use of force. Racial gaps are particularly large when it comes to support for Africa-related policies. They're also smaller in some areas. And so we already showed you that there are gaps related to spreading democracy. Those gaps are very small, smaller on average than other racial gaps. So are gaps on nuclear arms control, that sort of puzzling finding that we had previously. So the gap exists a lot smaller on average than other gaps in the data set. The terrorism threat gap also tends to be a lot smaller than other gaps. And so that's what this plot helps us to understand. A couple more slides and they'll just open up to questions. So we did this plot here that looks at questions that are either related to no region or to a particular region in the world. And then we divide them up into different things that they focus on. So some of them focus on like, how important is this issue, human rights or something like that? How much of a vital interest is a particular country? So like, how vital is Egypt to the US foreign policy? Is it vital interest? How threatening is a particular issue? Should a country use force? How do you feel about trade with a certain place? What do you support aid in a certain place? Do you support military bases in a certain place? Darker squares mean that there is a larger absolute gap in the intersection of those two things, so the region and the topic. And so what we see is that the largest gaps pertain to Africa. That's where the darkest squares are. And particularly to vital interest questions. So how important is South Africa to the US foreign policy would fit in there. And aid. So how important is it for the United States to give aid to Mali? Then you see that there are other regions where there actually are some pretty large gaps. For example, the importance of countries in the Americas or military basing in the Americas as well. There are big differences on ideas about the use of force as related to Europe. And so those are the areas where you start to see the largest gaps as well. And that's a different way of understanding this. So I'm going to wrap up at this point, and then we can chat. Overall, about a third of the questions in our sample of 1,500, so about 500, have a statistically significant racial gap. That's not small, right? There are some places where there are these very large gaps when compared to, or very small gaps when compared to other issues. Directional gaps, so that first set of analyses, exist within each of the 4 touchpoint areas, and they lead us to understand that Black Americans express greater support for issues like human rights, democracy promotion, aid, environmentalism, and immigration, but they express less support for cooperating with communists, or the use of force, or military basing, or arms control, and they also perceive less threat from terrorism. Gaps related to the exercise of American power and related to treatment of other marginalized groups are the largest in our data set. And overall, we argue that these findings indicate that citizens' experiences with race shape the way that they think about the world and America's role in it, and where America should be involved internationally. And so that's sort of the overall finding of the paper. So I'm happy to take questions, but thanks again for having me.
I'm going to ask the first question and then start making a list of people here and online. And my question has to do with whether there is any data that you've seen that would help illuminate the following issues. I think minorities like women tend to be less willing to support the use of force. But that's almost always measured in terms of getting involved, starting a war, being engaged in war.
Mm.
Once you're in a war, there can be a tension between the wanting to protect soldiers and wanting to not be involved. Protecting soldiers might mean getting more involved, might mean a surge in some ways. So do you have data from this, from the Chicago polls or others, that illuminate the question about differences or potential differences between the use of force generally, meaning intervention,
Mhm.
versus the use of force in terms of how one uses force, willing to take more casualties or willing to inflict more casualties on adversary, including adversary civilians? Because that would, I think, would illustrate a tension that exists in the real world that I'd be interested in potential findings.
Yeah. So in not actually in this paper, but in the other paper, the security studies paper, we look at polling data that's not just from Chicago Council. We actually have polls that are from a number of different surveys that are available through Roper iPolls, so ABC polls, NBC polls, YouGov polls, just like anything that was asking about the use of force. And we're able to follow Black American and white American attitudes towards the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War from before invasions happened, so like pre going into Iraq and pre going into Afghanistan, all the way through very well into both of the conflicts. And we find that that gap is persistent across presidential administrations, so Bush administration and Obama administration. And we also find that it changes a little, right? So like Black people are more supportive of the use of force under Obama than they are under Bush, but there still is a gap there. I think that often the questions are not very sophisticated. And so you wouldn't necessarily see a question that says, the surge will protect American soldier lives. So do you support a surge? If you had seen that, then maybe you would see, like some consideration of, oh, actually, the way to save American lives is escalation. But rather, it'll be, do you support withdrawing from
or a surge?
Yeah, or it'll say like sometimes there are a few questions that ask specifically about like how important are casualties to you. So would you support greater action in Iraq if it came at the cost of US casualties? And that's very helpful to us. But very much in that scenario, we find that Black Americans are very sensitive to that question and don't want to see the casualties happen.
Yeah. I mention all this because the revisiting Hiroshima and Iran work that I did with Ben Valentino shows that race doesn't have an impact on willingness to kill innocent Iranians in order to protect civilians, American soldiers,
right?
Which is counterintuitive, but could be explained by this kind of logic. I have Lauren and then Hannah, and if you could introduce yourself first, Lauren, for the online group, say a little bit about what you do, and then pass the microphone over to Hannah afterwards.
Hi, I'm Lauren Davenport. I'm a professor here in political science. I study American politics with a focus on racial and ethnic identity in the US. So here you're comparing Blacks with whites. And I was wondering about other ethno-racial minority groups. Are the Black attitudes that you show unique to Black people, or is it, does it apply to people of color in the US more generally, including like Asians and Latinos? Because I noticed the 4 touch points, I think, could be relevant for these other groups, right? Like you focus on rights and freedoms, skepticism about exercise of state power, empathy for other marginalized groups, right? Like Asians and Latinos also experience discrimination in the US. I could imagine that they similarly, express less support for cooperating with communist regimes, for example. So I know that you limit your analyses to Blacks and whites, but given the sample size, you probably have a large number of Asians and Latinos that you could also examine. And so, yeah, I was just wondering if it's, generally a white, non-white, white people of color gap.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I know that you are focused on this a lot. And so some of the things that I'll say in response, I think you're really well aware of. I would say generally that, so we did a lot of looking into this for the other paper that I was talking about, where we looked at attitudes specifically towards the use of force between different groups. And we found less consistency. So like that's, I think, because sometimes the racial attitudes, for example, of Latinos are sometimes like very dispersed depending on the background of that group, right? So you don't see as much coherence sometimes to attitudes on particular topics. I mean, it depends on whether you're like somebody who's Mexican versus somebody who's Cuban when they came to the United States, because that has implications for why they came, many things like that. And so, there's something remarkable about Black political attitudes, which is why there's been such a rich literature about it in REP that speaks to this group cohesion that we thought might carry into the work. And because of the complexity of what we were finding with other racial groups, we thought it would certainly do a disservice to like every group if we tried to like cram every different group's racial attitudes into one paper on foreign policy. We also thought that probably if that study were to be done that you're talking about, it should be in relation to the particularities of the racial categories, which are very unique in the United States. And as I say, if I'm looking at Latinos, Hispanic people, and their views towards the different foreign policy items, I want to focus in on how many Latino immigrants came to the United States. I want to focus on different subgroups within that population. And so there's a lot to be found there, actually. And there's some places where you do see gaps with white attitudes as well. And I think that, like there is an open sort of like gap in the literature waiting for more writing on this. And so that's one of the places where the gap exists.
And then we have Mike Powers.
Hi, thanks, Naima, for this talk. This is absolutely fascinating, and I think I definitely agree with your assessment that it's urgently needed, especially in IR, to kind of like consider race more, especially in terms of like the foreign policy opinion gaps that you're talking about. My name is Johanna Rodanoak. I'm one of the postdoctoral, I'm getting there, postdoctoral fellows here, and just wanted to appreciate the research.
I appreciate it.
One of the postdoctoral scholars here at CSAC. And I have two questions, but one is very quick. Basically just because you mentioned in the beginning that you think there are a lot of policy implications that can be derived from this research. And I just wanted to ask you to expand on that, like which ones do you have in mind that you could derive? And the second one was regarding the puzzling findings about the support for the lesser support for nuclear arms control and why that would be. I suppose you haven't like looked into this for this paper, but I was wondering if one of the so just spitballing here, if one of the explanations could be related to Caleb's work that's going to come out soon with relation to like the democratic peace and how this is essentially like priming ethnocentrism and like racism, right? So that the concern is here maybe not that other countries might get the bomb, but that is Black and brown people who get the bomb. So is it possible that one of the explanations could be that Black people would be more like less in support for nuclear arms control because this might empower non-white people to get the bomb as well? You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Which might be like more a concern for white population because, racism. Thanks. Who's next?
That's interesting. Should I let two people ask before I answer?
No. I'm just trying to make it easier to get the microphone back and forth while you answer.
Anyway, so a couple of things. So first of all, you asked about policy implications. I think that there are policy implications. I also think that people should not necessarily take this too far. There are a lot of ways that you could stretch these findings to make claims that I think are not substantiated by the data that we have, and nor should it be used in certain ways. But I think ultimately it's helpful to know how different communities in the US are thinking about foreign policy, because at the end of the day, like policymakers, people who want to be policymakers need to understand that there's diversity in the ways that people are thinking about these issues, right? And so, there are certain ways that we talk about the US competition with China and like what's at stake, and maybe the ways that those conversations are had in certain communities should look a little bit different in order to resonate with certain citizens as compared to other citizens. To your second question on just why we see this lesser support for nuclear arms control, yeah, we're still puzzling over it. I mean, I'm a fan of Caleb's work, and so we'll have to think about maybe that is. we have. Maybe that is a suggestion that we should look into in terms of explaining it that way. We all, it might also be just a deterrence argument, right? Like, and it might just be that, like, no, we have these nukes and it makes war less likely, and we don't like war, and so we don't like arms control. Yeah, it could be that too.
Mike, and then we will turn it over to Caleb.
Hi, Mike Toms, professor in
Jack.
the political science department. I actually have a couple of questions, so maybe you can put me back at the end of the list for the second one, because there are two involved questions, and I'll just ask one of them and then save the other one for later.
Thank you for your discipline, Mike.
Fine. You don't always exercise it, but
You're modeling
today-
something important, so that's good.
So Jim asked you before, do any of these analyses, what you were calling your directional analyses, control or partial out things like demographics and RDID? Why did you not do that?
Yeah. Okay. So
I have a suggestion if you think that it's not possible, but
So we figured out a way to do it for partisan polarization. And basically the issue is that, so these are question level, right? So particular question is the row in the data set.
yes.
So if you think about the particular question being the row in the data set, then you're not looking at an individual's demographics, you're looking at differences in, demographics. And so the way that we accounted for partisan polarization, as I said, is the same as the race, except for we looked at different people of different political backgrounds. So Democrats minus Republicans, right? That measures. So I guess you could look at like a difference in socioeconomic polarization as like during the particular survey in order to look at some of these other control variables. But this is where we had a hard time controlling for a lot of these demographics. It's not just controlling for the people, but it's controlling specifically for within this group. How do you characterize the entire question in the poll? And
Yeah, I mean, I think in the absence of having the individualized data, but having presumably marginals for each of these groups on party ID and other demographics, what you would want to do is regress the black-white gap in Y, which is your dependent variable, on the black-white gap in each of the control variables. So party would be one, age or other demographics would be the other. You essentially have grouped data. I mean, and I wrote it out. I can show it to you later.
Oh yeah, I see it.
So yeah, it's the differences in Y, and the control variables are the differences in the X's between between the two groups. And then what you'd want to know is your intercept. Is there anything left of the intercept after you have controlled for that or not? And
thank you. Yeah, I like it a lot.
I don't know, who does this go to next? Caleb?
Over to Caleb and
that was gonna be my question, but he also might provide a solution that I was not armed with, so you can skip me for now.
Okay, but do you want to say something about your forthcoming APSR paper? Because that was what I think Hannah teed you up.
Yes.
Hannah teed you up perfectly for that.
Without it being self-promotion, I guess.
She was encouraging self-promotion. That's okay.
Please do.
Yeah, I'm Caleb Pomeroy. I'm a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow, and really interesting, important project, and really big fan of the work. I guess the paper that Hannah mentioned, and it's great to have Mike Toms in the room. Basically, we find that when you experimentally vary democracy versus non-democracy, subjects hear democracy and they assume white like us, no, we shouldn't bomb them. When you tell them actually it's a non-white democracy, the democratic peace effect substantially declines. And what that implies is that democracy regime type carries with it associations with race, basically implicitly racialized. And I guess maybe to riff on Hannah's second point is on the DV side, on the questions that they're asking. I wonder if these questions don't necessarily speak for themselves, that maybe some of the items contain concepts like nuclear weapons that are themselves racialized, that when a white respondent hears nuclear weapons, they think deterrence, and maybe when a black respondent here's nuclear weapons, they think like the white man's bomb, and we get into these like discourses around civilized versus barbaric. And in South Africa, should black people be given control over the bomb versus if a white regime is in control of the bomb, maybe they're more trustworthy. So maybe you could if you have any thoughts on maybe certain items that might not be measuring the same thing depending on who's answering the question.
I think in a lot of cases, what we're trying to argue is that when asked these questions, Black and white people have different conceptions of even what they mean, and that might be why they're answering them differently. So yeah, I think that your point is really well taken, and I think that I don't want to name just one or two areas because I think there are a number of areas where that might actually be happening, and that's part of the explanation for why you see the gap. Yeah.
There could be some of those examples where intuitively you look at it and you say, I could imagine that there's that factor in and of itself could impose some kind of logic, like this democratic assumption for many people led them to think it's a white democracy. Yeah, I think this could be a whole another set of papers. I think
Catch us next year for.
I'm going to ask one question online, but I want to encourage people. We have former lab directors, we have former fellows, some current fellows, we have some former Senate staffers, so I want to encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A. And one of them just says, is there anything that you're seeing that your work can help you understand opinion about the war in Gaza today? When you look at either protests or what's going on in the House, how does race influence judgments? I know you don't have data on it, but just as you're following the news, are there any insights that you have to share with us?
Definitely. I mean, I think there's been
Harold.
Black political activity on the Israel-Hamas war, on also what's happening in Gaza when it comes to humanitarian implications. You know, you've seen Black pastors sort of collectively speak out in support of Palestinians. This is a really interesting topic because so about a decade ago, Peter Grease wrote a book about characteristics of American society that impact attitudes on foreign policy. And he had a whole chapter where he talked about views toward Israel-Palestine, but he looked specifically within the Christian community because what's interesting is that Black people are often Christian, they're often likely to be religious, and actually religious communities are sometimes more pro-Israel in the United States, Christian communities. But at the same time, there's a narrative that weaves together Palestinian struggle that then speaks to that empathy mechanism that we pointed out. And so I think that what I've seen play out is that sometimes there is that difference. Sometimes you do see like Black churches that are super pro-Israel because of the way that other churches are super pro-Israel as well. Sometimes though you see, and I think increasingly you see Black activists who are starting to link suffering within groups of Palestinians to other types of suffering that Black communities are concerned with. So it's a great question. And yeah, I do think that a lot of things are relevant about this study to this particular moment.
Great. Now we have Harold and then Cameron. So.
Harold Trincunas, Deputy Director here at CSAC. Really fascinating research. And I wanted to follow up on something I think you said, which is it looked like on some of the issues there was like cross-temporal sort of updating of the experience. People, so maybe there's a sort of generational effects are happening on some issues and not others. And what led me to ask this question was you gave the example of, you know, Black experience in Vietnam, higher casualties, and how that sort of carries forward. I'm wondering if maybe it's possible to look at how experiences related to changing demographics in Afghanistan and Iraq and casualty distributions led to cross-temporal updating relative to that, or are these views sort of relatively sticky? Because this is not really that study in really very early. But anyway, cross-temporal updating, and that's just one example.
So it's a really big time range, you know, 1975 to 2018 is several decades. And I actually think that you see more stickiness around certain issue areas, but when you're seeing differences, for example, in those plots of directional gaps that I showed you, it's because the human rights issue is changing over time. A big one is related to terrorism, and so like in the early 2000s, terrorism was also linked to like a lot of blame towards Arabs that sometimes I think people interpret it as like, whoa, that's like a lot of pressure that they're putting on this community. And some certain Black communities have felt that. And so is it really that much of a threat? Right. And so if you ask about terrorism in the 2000s as compared to asking about terrorism in the 1980s, it's a different group of people that you might be envisioning. And I think that's where you see some of the updating and variation. It's like the specific current events that are relevant at the time that are related to these overall concepts. I think there's less when it comes to like, like the Afghanistan war here and there. Although I will say in the other paper that I did on the use of force, basically we look at this mediator of the relationship between race and support for the use of force. That is like trust in the president in office, and Obama had like huge effects on that indicator because there's a lot more trust of Obama than there was of Bush among Black communities. And so it sort of like changed the way that mediator worked in the particular analyses. So it could be not just the topic that's changing, but like the political atmosphere on the whole and how that affects how people are thinking about issues.
Cameron Tracy, I'm a research scholar here at CSAC. Thanks for the great talk. When it comes to the touch points, I'd imagine there could be significant tension between skepticism over exercise of state power and support for human rights when it comes to military force that is billed as a humanitarian intervention. So when it comes to Kosovo in '99, for example, I'd imagine if there were a question on that, you would put it into the military use of military force category. But perhaps more so than other uses of military force, it might somewhat fit into the human rights or support for human rights category.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder in the data, did you see any interaction there where for conflicts, at least that were ostensibly about humanitarian intervention, support seemed to follow a different trend than those that were more clearly about or more clearly perceived as military force without that human rights component?
So we looked at some of the outliers that existed in the data related to, for example, use of force. And what we found were that the two biggest outliers were kind of related to what you're talking about. So there was like a difference in the way that Black was related to white when it came to use of force, particularly on questions related to South Africa. Kind of speaks to what you're talking about. And also when it came to the use of force to prevent the flow of illegal drugs, but you might also think that that's relevant to the Black experience, right? So like drugs have wrecked certain communities, and so maybe there's like a different level of allowance for that type of activity if it's gonna stem this big problem for people in the United States. And so yeah, we saw some of that, some things, and we tried to look in the outliers to understand what was going on in those particular cases.
Jim Fearon, and then Lindsay ran next to him afterwards.
Jim Fearon, political science and IR within that. Two things I think they're quick. First, I mean, it's totally fascinating. I have a question. So you're teaching us about difference of opinion across different issue areas. Have you also looked, or is there good research on the overall weighting of foreign policy versus domestic policy? So, one might also think that when you ask the kind of what are the most important issues questions, that African Americans might put foreign policy things lower down than, I don't know, domestic economic or other type things. I don't know. Has that changed over time? Are we seeing an increase in in focus on foreign policies? Yeah, I don't know. I'm curious about that. And then this is like a super or more techie type thing, but in terms of analyzing the gap sizes, this may very well not be an issue, but there can, if we're, as I understood the way you formulated it, you're looking at like the absolute difference in the percentages, like saying yes or no. But arguably, like, if the difference is like 75% said yes in, African Americans versus 70%, that's like actually a bigger, if you're estimating a race effect, than like 55 versus 50, because it's like harder to move that same amount when you get closer to a boundary. There's a simple way to do that with looking at the log odds of the percentage, but probably it doesn't matter because pollsters tend not to ask questions that are like 90% of people say yes or no, but just wondering. But that would kind of standardize better, because right now effectively you're putting a little more weight on the more divisive questions, as it were, or the more evenly divided ones.
Okay. I'm actually going to just answer that while it's on top of mind, because, I think a big question for us was to try and think about the best way to capture this, right? And we thought about a lot of different things that we might look at. We first thought, oh, what about the correlation between, like these two trends? But then that doesn't work, because actually that can underestimate gaps in certain scenarios. And so we thought, okay, this absolute gap, at least for size, seems to work. I bet there are some tests that we can do to try and figure out certainly there are tests we can do to figure out when we're looking at the 50 versus 55 and 70 versus 75. So we should just do those. Yeah, exactly. But I think that's a great point. So helpful at this stage for the project for us to think about that. To your first question, you asked me about foreign policy versus domestic policy. So we've had like different versions of this paper, and there was one paper in which, so we can definitely answer that particular question, because there were some domestic policy questions on these Chicago surveys, Chicago Council surveys. And so you could easily just do that particular importance question, which we have coded, and then look at domestic and foreign. Very easy to do. I don't think we've done exactly that version of the analysis, but we did do an analysis to see how the average racial gap over time changed. And there was this interesting thing that we found where, like, sometimes the average racial gap was greater for domestic policy and sometimes it was greater for foreign policy. But basically what we saw was that between like the late 1990s to the 2010s, you saw a case where the average racial gap on domestic issues had like a higher mean than on foreign policy issues, whereas on older surveys, you saw a bigger gap on foreign policy issues compared to domestic issues. And I thought that was interesting, but then it just became less interesting than some of the other stuff that's currently in the paper.
Lindsay and then Susan.
I'm Lindsay. I'm a postdoctoral fellow. Thank you. This is really interesting. I guess, and I don't really do regression, so maybe this was presented. Did you test if the cohesion was higher in one group than the other? And I'd be interested to know if that changes over time too, because one of your theories was the Black utility heuristic theory. So, it's just interesting to see if there's cohesion.
Yeah. I mean, actually this is something, so that is not something that we talk about in this paper, but we did actually look into this. So I guess the idea here is that if there's this collective experience of Black Americans and they tend to vote more democratically, right? Or they tend to have domestic policy preferences that are created based on racial experience, then you can actually see more cohesion around like a mean point for Black American attitudes as compared to whites, or that should be theoretically what's happening. And we did look into that within our data. We did a number of different things to try and see if we saw those patterns happening specifically for foreign policy questions. And the answer was not really. So not on foreign policy issues do we see that particular effect happening. So we didn't talk about it. It's not really happening, but if asked, that's the answer.
Susan Rice, visiting fellow here at FSI. It's good to see you, and thanks for this work. It's very interesting. I find your conclusions very intuitively logical, and especially as you assess the touch points. And so I'm not in any way disputing where you land. question is about your sample. You have some, I'm just now recalling from the paper, roughly 18 or 19,000 white respondents and slightly under 2,000 Black respondents over a 50-year period, 53-year period, ish, 50-ish years. So you would probably have precious few in each year or each, cohort. Is it what, every 2 or 3 years the survey's done?
Yeah, about 2 years, 3 years sometimes. Sometimes there's a little bit longer of a gap, but yeah.
Do you have any reservations about the sample being sufficiently representative, particularly when you spread it out over that period of time?
So you are right. We have 16,500 white respondents and only about 1975 Black respondents over the entire time period. So Black Americans are what, like 12% of the US population? Even if you're representative, you're going to have like a really small number of Black compared to white respondents. So what some people do methodologically in that case is they oversample on the Black community just to have, a better number of responses to deal with. Often when you get to numbers of like 2,000 of something, you start to feel like a little more confident with that type of an N, but you're right, this is spread over a lot of different years and a lot of different surveys. I think that the hope was that through an approach like this, through aggregating the data, we would be able to say more. So if we did this on like one sample from 1 year, we can say less because we've got a lot less data. The way that we've done this allows us to be more confident. You can look at sort of like the statistically, like the confidence intervals and things like that, and they're stronger because of the data set that we have. But frankly, I think that some of the approaches that others have taken, so there's a guy at the Carnegie Endowment named Chryl. I admired his work. I talk about all the time. And he's oversampled on Black respondents. And sometimes he's done surveys of only Black respondents to understand foreign policy attitudes among Black people. And I think that that is warranted and will give us other outcomes that maybe won't be detectable in the type of research we're doing. So, I agree with you that there's a small number. I think statistically, we weren't finding that we were underpowered in the sense that we couldn't make inferences from the data, but it's always useful to have a good number of the minorities so you can make the inference.
Thank you. And just a couple quick specific questions. Do you have an explanation for why, at least in more recent years, you think Black people become less protectionist on average than whites? And do you have any more recent information on Black attitudes towards immigration, say in the last 5 to 10 years, that might diverge from the 50-year norm? And then finally, I know you can't do this yet, but it'd be really interesting in the future to know if there are differences between the attitudes of African Americans and people of African descent who are more recent immigrants.
On that last point, I think you're so right. Yeah, these are great questions. So to your first, when you talk about Black communities being less protectionist in comparison to white communities, I think so. There's this other paper by Mutz et al. So Diana Mutz is at UPenn. I really like a lot of her work. She does really cool stuff, and you could look at that literature for an explanation. I think part of it has to do with white people and how they're thinking about sort of what the stakes are when we do trade, like who's losing out, right? And then you might extrapolate that Black communities, because they see things going to others who might benefit from them, being less concerned. So, I mean, theoretically in the literature, that's where that points to. I could be convinced by that argument, right? Like I could see Black community in the US being less concerned about trade with countries that's going to disadvantage the US, but going to help some people of color internationally that might. hmm And I think you have to make that connection. So often in these questions, it's not saying like, do you support free trade, which has also led to the loss of jobs? Like it's just asking about the free trade. So here's like one example that I think might have some marginal impact. There's a lot of movement around like buy black in the United States. And sometimes when I see like a list of black businesses, it's listing not only like things that are made domestic in the US, but like shea butter from West Africa. And so there might be some marginal effect of something like that on the way that Black people think about what happens when trade happens and who can benefit from it. But yeah, I hear you. Nah, I'm with you. And I'm happy to consider, or to have continue. I think the best explanation though is just that there might not be a frontline connection between like trade, like maybe if you ask about NAFTA or you ask about a specific like trade deal that's linked to job loss, okay, but like if you're just like, do you support free trade? Maybe some people aren't making that connection that it's also related to job loss.
A comment from online, and then
So
we'll
many
give.
questions she asked, but I'll answer your other
Oh,
questions.
well, no.
Yeah, you asked about immigration.
Sorry,
You also
I
asked,
apologize.
sorry. Yeah, I was really long-winded on that last one. The immigration findings are really interesting. Black people have become more supportive of immigration over time, but also like Black people could be thinking about immigration in a number of ways. They could be thinking about immigration from the standpoint of Latin Americans, because often that's where people go when they think about immigration. They might be thinking about immigration though, not in the in the Latin American sense. So exactly, that's a. This is part of what I mean. Yeah, it might have to do with those other issues as well. Exactly. And so therefore, when you're answering as a Black person, you're actually answering as an immigrant family instead of, so yeah, it could be either of those. And I think we say something really short about that. Like there's a few mechanisms that might explain that, but we can't differentiate in the way we've displayed our data. Yeah, totally with you on it would be great to do research that distinguishes different types of histories within Black communities. Um, we've talked, I mean, I've written about this, like it's important to happen. Public opinion polling on foreign policy attitudes has been really poor about, even like getting racial data. And so we're just getting to the point where you see polls that even ask questions like that.
A comment from online that addresses potentially the issue that Caleb raised. One of your surprising findings was the arms control finding, but if some kinds of arms control are considered to be unfair, like the NPT, other ones like Russian American arms control is considered preventing war, that may, you've clumped it all together as arms control, but the questions may be different in there, and that could help explain that surprising finding.
That's true. And it looks like we have like a pretty consistent number of questions over a lot of different years. And so it might be, but there are some categories really like if there were less than, as I mentioned, like 6 questions, we didn't even include it because it was too little, but this is an area where we might be able to do some subdivision. So we'll look into it. Thank you.
Okay, so this is a suggestion for your
This is
next.
Phil Mike Toms. So
Yeah, this is
people online can't see you, Mike, so they don't.
Mike Toms from Political Science again. So this is a suggestion for your next paper, I think. I mean, I think it's amazing that you assembled all of the data sets that you did and are leveraging those. But I think to me, a more compelling study would be your own original study with the following features. Be a large sample, probably with an oversample of Black respondents, in which you measured their adherence to each of your 4 touch points. And you asked them a series of foreign policy dependent variables and conducted something like a mediation analysis where you ask, how does race correlate with each of those 4 touch points, and how do those touch points in turn drive attitudes toward foreign policy? And because I think like some of these touch points, it is true that Black lived experiences increase support for rights and freedom, make some people skeptical of state power, et cetera. But I would think that a number of whites would also share those views as well. So I think you'd want to measure each of the touch points and then their relationship to the outcome. And then if you wanted to take it next level, since your argument is that Blacks and whites have different lived experiences, which lead to different levels of attachment to these touch points, if there's any way of getting any variation within the Black community or within the white community in lived experiences, you would have a more falsifiable theory than what you have right now, where you're kind of saying all Blacks have these same lived experiences and therefore have this attachment. So that's an individual level version of the study that you could use to supplement the aggregate analysis that you've done.
I'm writing notes on what you're saying, and it's like looking like a lot of notes that this is a research agenda and there's a lot of research to be done. And as I'm writing, I'm like, oh yeah, that reminds me of that thing that I was thinking about. So you're right. There are lots of studies to be done that could, that would have benefits that are not the benefits of this paper. So I think, when you think about the data to use and the methods to use, there are some benefits to what you're talking about, to doing an original survey and then to being able to link very closely the touch point to the outcome because you've got all the questions designed by yourself. I think to some extent, though, I'm a big fan of survey research and experiment research, is that you just lose a little bit of like the real lifeness of it, because we've got these data over time periods where you're talking about events that you can't really replicate. Like you can't necessarily you can give somebody a vignette, but you can't put them in 1975 and ask them to answer a question in the same way that you get. Oh, I know.
I'm not proposing that you ask them whether they support the Vietnam War.
Right,
I mean,
right. I know, right.
choose the dependent variables that are relevant to today. But I didn't think there was anything in your theory in particular that suggested variation over time and in a way that you would have to leverage between 1975 and today.
So my point is, great point. I think that you're right. I should do that research. I guess the point I was trying to make is that I think that there's some value to being able to examine how this has changed over time and to look at the different issue areas that at the time were contemporaneous and the ways that people were. So that's why I think there's room for all of this type of work, and having that piece plus this piece combined is going to really solidify the deal in a clear way. So thank you for this very nicely outlined paper that I may indeed just write.
I think the best seminars are those where the speaker helps us understand answers to a really important puzzle, and that the discussion creates more puzzles and more future research. So I hope that just is a way of inviting you to come back and talk about future research as well. Join me in thanking Naima.
Thanks a lot, everybody. This is really, really useful feedback too. We're at the point where we really can use all of this. So thank you very much.